Hello everyone, namaste. My name is Sheila Eisele, and today I'm presenting on the wisdom of Jupiter in Scorpio. Before I begin, I want to say that I'm just so incredibly grateful for this community. I love this group. It's become my spiritual home. Just gives me so much support and is such a rich resource for me. I'm especially grateful for the time that I've spent with Jeffrey Wolf Green's teachings. And I feel as though, Jeffrey and I have a very good dialogue going between us, and I'm learning a lot from Jeffrey. So as we go to begin this, I want to give you some idea of my unique perspective. I'm not new to astrology. I first became interested in it many years ago when I was studying to become a depth psychologist, because the approach that I take is transpersonal psychology. So it's informed very much by Carl Jung's works, by Joseph Campbell, understanding of myth, archetypal astrology with James Hillman. And so astrology is really important to this process. I feel, though, however, that I didn't really get into astrology because my background is, my professional background is a degree in theology and a degree in depth psychology. So I wasn't quite sure how to use astrology as a bridge or how it would fit exactly. I didn't use it as well as say Carl Jung did. And when I became housebound with another, I've had many health challenges, which you'll see in my chart, I think. I became housebound 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, 12 years ago. I felt this hunger to return to the study of astrology, and first found Stephen Forrest, and then eventually found Jeffrey Wolf Green. And it's when I found Jeffrey, and when I began to, I stumbled on these videos on YouTube and began to really explore this part, that finally everything clicked. It just clicked, and it provided this wonderful bridge for me, and it really also fits my chart, as you'll see eventually. So first I'd like to, before we move on to the next slide, Linda, which I don't want to do yet, I'd like to just mention why I chose this picture. I chose this picture because, as a background, because I feel that, this really speaks to Jupiter in Scorpio. The whole idea behind the house of Scorpio and behind Pluto, who is really in the archetypes, Pluto is the brother of Jupiter, and Jupiter is, or Zeus, is the king of the gods and the lord of justice, right? Fathered by Saturn, and grandfather, grandchild of Uranus. And he's portrayed, Jupiter, holding the eagle and a bolt of lightning as his staff. We usually associate lightning with Uranus, but maybe he inherited this from his grandfather. But that lightning-like light, that pierces, and there's a sense in which anyone who's really been, associated with people who have a strong Sagittarius signature can sometimes feel as though the things that they say, what they bring to you, cuts through everything, and it just pierces right down. Because Sagittarius is a fire sign, It pierces right down between the flesh and the bone and goes right to the heart of things. And that really speaks to Jupiter's nature. It's said he prefers peace rather than violence. But as Lord of the sky, lightning and thunder, and Lord of justice and order, with force and violence as his servants, this peace lover Jupiter may not guide us gently into the underworld, into the territory of his sibling Pluto. Pluto, the ruler of Scorpio, gives us a flavor as to this territory that we're going to be traversing with Jupiter in Scorpio. We'll be crossing into the realm of the underworld, diving deep, perhaps risking the death by drowning of our beliefs, our gods, losing our ability to make meaning out of life itself. And here I'm coming from the place of, I worked as a spiritual midwife for my professional career for all of the time that I was in the public. I worked helping people in transition, whether it was adolescence, midlife crisis, the death of their marriage, and I also worked in trauma and emergency, working in a large teaching hospital as counselor there, helping people to make meaning at the time that they were in some of the deepest crises in their lives. And then I ended my public career by working for several years in hospice, accompanying those who were either dying or family and loved ones of those who were dying, helping them to make meaning. So I know from experience, both in my own life, as you'll see eventually from my chart, and as in my public life, I have understood that these experiences of the 8th house, this diving deep into the Scorpionic archetype, evokes existential core fears, particularly the core fear of abandonment, but also the fear of separation. These are our two core fears. And the fear of separation has to do with rejection, right? It's not just the abandonment, but that we may be rejected. And this is relative to, of course, the 8th house relationship to the 2nd house, because the 2nd house is the house of our foundation, where we are nurtured and where we survive. And so even our very survival issues can get triggered here. In this case, perhaps Jupiter in Scorpio suggests a crisis of meaning making, a crisis of faith, a crisis and challenge around where and in whom to place our trust. As I look at the current transits of these, especially more the larger outer planets, right? And when I look at Saturn, the father of Jupiter, we look at Saturn is in Sagittarius, Pluto's in Capricorn, and Jupiter in Scorpio. And this suggests to me that our relationship with power, particularly in areas where it is still experienced as power over rather than power with and for us, is undergoing a deconstruction. And I think that we can see this. We just look at our world and we see that is in fact happening. Our beliefs previously informed by this conditioning of the power over model are going to be in crisis everywhere. And we can see this in particular because we just have to think about where the south nodes of these 3 planets are. They're all in Capricorn, right? So we're going to be seeing, the structures related to power and related to, the form and leadership in government and just everywhere are going to be under stress, are going to be in crisis. And this is good for us. It's good for us. It's preparing us for the time when Jupiter moves into Sagittarius. So now I think we could prepare by putting up the next slide, Linda. Now I just want to say, when it comes to crisis, we need to remember the Chinese symbol for crisis contains two elements. It's made up of two of their symbols. And these signify that there's both danger and opportunity present in a crisis. And that really fits the archetype of Scorpio, because Scorpio is not just dark. You know, the whole idea behind Scorpio is kind of like, you know, when we're our own heroes and we go down into the underground, we retrieve from the dragon the gold, we come up from death, we survive. What rises from the ashes is the phoenix. All these sort of symbols that we can use. So here's this sign: bidden or not bidden, God is present. When studying Latin when he was 19, psychologist Carl Jung came across this quote from the oracles of Delphi. And when he became older, he had this carved in Latin over the front door of his house in Zurich. The words originate from the reply by the Delphic oracle to the Lacedaemonians when they were planning a war against Athens. Yes, the gods will be present, but in what form and to what purpose? So whether we're conscious of it or not, our beliefs, our God, whatever form that takes, our gurus, the way that we make meaning out of life is always at work. We are what one of my professors called little hermeneutes from the time we're small. Children are making meaning. Hermeneutics is just the study of making meaning, right? And so we're these little meaning-making beings from the time we're very little. You can hear it in children once they're about 3, where they're asking questions like, what's this, Mummy? What's going on with this? Why is this? Why do I have to do that? You know, this is our attempts to understand what's going on in our life. And now, Linda, maybe if you can move to the 3rd slide, please. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my chart, because I want you to see that, first of all, that my chart will help illuminate to you some of the things that I want to share with you, but I also want you to see that, you know, and I think this is very important. We don't only want to know what does someone know because they're coming with whatever, you know, knowledge they possess that they got from books or courses or studies, but how is it grounded in their own being? Why is this important to them? Why does it matter? And how does that inform what they're bringing to us? Because it's important for us to choose our teachers, or those that we allow to give us information. In other words, they are coming to us. We are authoring our story ourselves, but as we are making meaning, we are authorizing others to inform us. So we want to make sure that they're good sources, right? And so I want to share with you, you know, where I'm coming from, so you have a context for yourself when you go to give weight to the things that I say. It tells you, well, what weight should I place on this? How does it resonate with me? How does it fit my story? So here we see that I'm a Sagittarius rising, and I'm a 9th house Virgo and Mercury. I have Pluto and the South Node conjunct in the 8th house, and I have the North Node in Aquarius in the 2nd house, and conjunct the North and the South Node and Pluto is Jupiter. Jupiter in Taurus. So I was bound to be a truth seeker. I mean, I don't see a way I could have escaped it with this chart. And that's the beauty of our charts. You know, they're the map, they're not the terrain, but they show us how wonderfully made we are, fearfully and wonderfully made. You know, this chart was designed for me to achieve my soul's purpose, right? And I can trust this chart. I can trust this chart as it shows me how beautifully my life has been designed to accomplish my incarnation. I'll share a little story with you here about my family of origin and what happened in there. When I got, I think into my teens, I went to my mother and I said to her, I was wanting to learn more about myself, right? And I went to my mother and I said, Mom, what was my first word? And she paused for a moment and then she said, why? And I already knew, well, that's just not possible, right? Because children, you know, their first words are naming things in their environment or people in their environment, like mama and dada. And I said to her, oh, that's not possible. A child couldn't do that at this time. I was wanting her to be accurate. That's a part of being Virgo. And I wanted her to search for a more truthful explanation and answer to what I was seeking the answer, right? The right answer. And Mom insisted. She was adamant. It was why. So I went to my father and I said, you know, Dad, Mom says that my first word was why, but that can't be right. So what's your recollection? What do you remember? And so he thought a minute and then he said, well, I remember you were always asking questions, always continually asking questions. And so he said to me, that's just the way of it. So now we can look at these, right? And these responses that they gave to my question and think about it. What does it mean? Which is more true? It's not factually accurate. It can't be factually accurate that my first word was why. But maybe it's more true that my first word was why when we consider the question, because we consider the intent behind the question. And the questions are always more important than the answers. Always, because there will be new questions arising out of the answer anyway. So with the questions more important than the answers, what we want to know is we want to know what is the intent of the question. So in this, the intent of the question was for me to learn how I am unique. How do I know more about myself? And is it really important whether I said mama or dada first? No. What's really important is that I said why, because this is, you know, essential to my nature. So how do I move from being a wise ass to wise? Because when I was little, one of my mother's friends came and she said to me when I was about 4, Sheila, what do you want to be when you grow up? You know how you ask children these questions. And my mother remembers that I answered wise. I wanted to be wise. So I knew this deep inside of me that this was a goal of mine. This was part of what I wanted to happen. But of course, early in my life, that was not what I managed to achieve. I was the wise ass. You know, I spelt it this way because I was always asking the questions. But the way that I came across was as a know-it-all, I was, I think my family were very gracious, and my friends, because I was just insufferable. I offered unsolicited advice. I pontificated on a whole lot of subjects. I held forth on any number of topics because I was curious. I was this learner, I'm not going to go in much to my 8th house and the Pluto, and there are so many things I could tell you from that, but I'm not going to go into that or go into the trauma and the more traumatic aspects of my childhood and what I believe that I brought with me, except to say this. During my teens, my mother, in exasperation, would often say, and my siblings remember this, "Just who do you think you are, the Queen of Sheba?" And, when I look at the Pluto South Node conjunction in the 8th house, maybe she was onto something, it could be that I was. And so, Linda, maybe we could move to the 4th chart now, the 4th slide. And this slide points to the fact, because I'm wanting us to look at how we get from what, maybe an inadequate set of beliefs, just that desire for, more knowledge, to be that know-it-all, in my case. How do we get there? Well, we tend to search for anything where it's easiest to find. This is known in psychological terms as the street-legged effect. And it's told best by, the story, or most typically by the story of the drunk who leaves the bar, gets to the car, and realizes they've lost their keys. They dropped their keys somewhere. So they go back to search for the keys. And where are they most likely to search? Where the light is, under the street lamp, even though the keys are most likely in the dark, right? So this points to the fact that we tend to look, just as we look for love in all the wrong places, we tend to search for anything, where it's easiest to find. And so in astrological terms, where are we most likely then to be searching for truth? And that's along the horizon. And so that gives you a hint of what we're going to be looking at in the personal chart. So if we go back to my chart for a moment, Linda, the previous slide, we look at that and we see that on my horizon, ascendant is Sagittarius, and I even have Mars on the ascendant, so very strong, And then we look across the horizon, and this is what becomes important, I believe, in finding where will the person be searching to make meaning. What will they revert to? Because we do this because in understanding of neuroscience and psychology, we do it because when these fears which arise in the crisis, which get triggered in the crisis, are triggered and bring up these survival fears, they occur at the place of the brain, which is at the base of the brain. So they occur in the area known as the amygdala. And the amygdala signals the adrenal glands, which then get us in fight or flight mode. So our instinct is to calm that. We don't like those feelings, and we want to comfort ourselves and to calm that. And we look where it's easiest because we go by instinct. We're not in our conscious mind, we're down in the base of our brain and we're trying to survive. And so the natural thing to do is the easiest thing to do. And so we can see then where the inadequate pattern, and for me, now I'm not far along in this, but I've been investigating charts And I've been seeing that sometimes this is where addiction can show up as well. So is in this relationship of Pluto and the nodes to the ascendant, the descendant. So we can look in my chart and we can see that I would be looking to bolster the self, because remember, the Pluto archetype means that there's an issue of security, right? And that's because of the relationship to the second house, right? But there's this somewhat this insecurity, even though it's the soul's intent, it's still, so we look at whatever house and sign that Pluto is in. And so for me, Pluto is in the 8th house, so very strong. And we're looking at, I would want to bolster my sense of self and my sense of individuality. I want to shine, and how would I shine? With more knowledge. I would go to knowledge. And so I ended up with an addiction to knowledge. That's where I would revert. Every time that I felt, threatened in any way, I would seek to know more. I just wanted to pile on more knowledge. And so in today's world, I might go and do a Google search on whatever it is that I feel is a threat to me. And when I experienced threats, which we'll see, we can see in my chart, in fact, really serious challenges occurred with Jupiter, because Jupiter is square the nodes and happens to be in Taurus. So every time that there was a hard aspect to Jupiter, I experienced a crisis. Now we think of Jupiter as benefic, and it is. It has been an enormous blessing in my life, a wonderful blessing, but a blessing through what I needed for my evolutionary intent. And so was experienced most often as crisis, very often health crisis. My second child died in a SIDS death. And of course, Jupiter is in the 5th house. I had lots of children, and Pluto is in Leo. So, my losing a child is very consistent with that. So all of these things have helped me to make meaning, because they've offered me crises. And I have been blessed in that I have been able to come from the depths of these 8th house experiences with the gold, with the illumination, the illumined awareness that I would be able to use in the 9th house. So let's go now to the 5th slide. Martin Luther said, "Your God is that to which your heart clings, in which you confide." I chose this picture to show that my heart clung to more knowledge, get more knowledge. And by confide here, Martin Luther in his time in the 15th century was using the term much like we would use the term trust today. And it's what we base our word confidence on, and it comes from the Latin fide, meaning to have faith. So what happens when our gods are inadequate for times of crisis and transition? Linda, if you could move to the next slide. Well, just ask Harvey Weinstein. We can see what happens, or Donald Trump, and certainly this is what I experienced. This slide represents a poster that I actually had back in the 70s, which hung in my home. And in that poster, which the original of which I couldn't find on the internet and I no longer have, was by Argus, copyright 1976, and it showed a soft sculpture of a Raggedy Ann, life-sized Raggedy Ann, being put through an old wringer washer. So the truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable. And I think that's a pretty good picture for what we might experience with Jupiter in Scorpio. And my favorite room during that period of my life was the room for improvement. I think those who love me, who are close to me, would say, it's still my favorite room. But it shows up differently now. In my early years, I didn't aim so much for perfection, but I had an anxiety about making sure that I did everything right, that I put everything that I could into it, and I kept aiming constantly to be better. And now there's a much deeper level of contentment with allowing all that is just to be, and with realizing that there's really something to be said for good enough. And so the phrase that accompanies me now is more, is this fit for purpose? So that's how, my ninth house sun would be working, saying, is this fit for purpose? Will it actually serve the highest and best good of all it is and of myself? And now we can move to the seventh slide, I mean. Here, what I want to do, my intention here was, and I asked Linda to help me create this slide. So she's done the charts and gave me this wheel of creation, because the natural zodiac is the wheel of creation for us, and it shows us how we create anything, whether it's our beliefs, it's a project, or as Boaz suggested in the last talk, a relationship. It doesn't matter what it is. It starts in Aries. That's where the desire starts. So we first have a desire for something. So if we're conscious of it, we would recognize maybe a desire to make meaning, and the desire to have a personal philosophy that helps us to move through the whole of life, the whole of the cycles of creation in our life. And then in the second house, in Taurus, we would be nurturing that desire. We would be feeding that desire. We would be helping that desire to grow, and giving it a foundation so that it can continue to grow. In the third house, what will happen is we'll enter into dialogue. And this is so important, because the child does not even understand itself as a self until it meets perhaps the sibling, but definitely has that understanding, of being other to someone else, or of someone else being other. So this would be the time when maybe mother holds the child up in front of the mirror, and the child is old enough. This happens usually after the child has been able to begin moving away from the parents. So they've attained the ability to crawl, and then maybe to start walking and toddling away. And we see in the child, when that happens really often, they'll take their first steps and then look back at their mother or their father who is helping them to walk, and smile and look for approval, right? And when the mother is holding the child up to the mirror, if she does it before the baby has made this natural move away from the mother, began to journey apart from the mother, usually the child won't recognize that the mother and the child are separate. You can tell just by looking at them. They don't see two different people. But when they're ready, they distinguish the mother as the mother and the child is the child. So whenever we are creating something, once we get to this communication house, this Gemini house, and this is where we're generating ideas, but we're also, in a sense, having those ideas mirrored back to us. And hopefully we enter into a dialogue, and it's not just a monologue. So then we carry it forward into the next sphere of influence, if you like, into the fourth house of the tribe, the family. And here we find out, does it receive, is it received? Is it welcomed in the tribe? We test it out in the tribe. But it can also become conditioned in the tribe, because when we look to Freud, this is where Freud would have talked about our superego. And our superego is of course going to condition us. And we know that a lot of our patterns of conditioning come from the tribe. So this area of influence is very important. We can gain a lot of strength from it. But as with any bonds of relationship, they can become bondage, not just the ties that bind for strength, right? So we will be working that out in the fourth house. And then we arrive in the fifth house, and here we have, the self, or the creation. We had the desire, and now we have the creation in a way, and it shines, and we like it, and we begin to, sort of play with it and think about it in different ways. Or how might, and we always anticipate the next house in the previous house. So we begin, how might this be of use? And then we step into the sixth house, where we examine this creation, these beliefs, because we're talking about beliefs, this way of making meaning. And we ask ourselves, is it fit for purpose? And the relationship here, and of course all the houses are in relationship to the house opposite them, and a lot of information is going back and forth. But here we look at it and we consider, when we ask fit for purpose, I would suggest we ask it in relationship to the 12th house, in particular, as we're analyzing it, as we're discovering whether it will work to yield a harvest. A harvest for who? For the one, for the whole. Does it serve our highest and best good? And then we take it to the next sphere of influence. We keep widening, growing our sphere of influence. And so we take it to the civic arena. And I would like to remind you here of something that Ralph Waldo Emerson talked about. And he said that, we must first be a self before we can be part of the group. Now this speaks more back to the 5th house, 11th house relationship. But it's also talking about when we enter society, when we want to become, we want to enter into society and enter into relationships. If we haven't really integrated all the houses that come before well, we will not be well prepared to enter into society and into the wider relationships. And so this creates conflict for us, right? And takes us all the way back, oftentimes, to the 1st house. And so we end up, going between the poles. And this is the paradox of life. And the way that we resolve the poles, the way we resolve the paradoxes, is by embracing the paradox. We don't, just try to sit on one pole or the other, including with our lunar nodes. Even though we're moving toward the north node, we need to embrace the paradox of the nodes and the nodal axis. This is true for every axis. And I wanted to take us this far because I want us to understand then why it's important when we take our beliefs, which, when we take them into relationship, they're going to get tested in the relationships in society, every relationship that we have. And if they're weighed, put on the scales, and found wanting, we will be sent back, to integrate again and to figure out, where is it that. But then once we reach the 8th house, this is the proving ground, because all of what we have brought to the 8th house will be lost completely unless it survives. Only what survives, only what is fit for purpose, only what will be illumined awareness will reach the 9th house when we have our gods and our beliefs. And so we saw what happened when we have an inadequate God. The truth will set you free, but first it will make you miserable. If we want to avoid the misery, as much of the misery as possible of the 8th house experience, then we will do our work, our preparation in the earlier houses. And we can turn to a wonderful story for this, which is the myth of Hercules, and Hercules slays in the myth of Scorpio, in our understanding of Scorpio. Hercules' 8th task was to slay Hydra. And I love that, because even the name of the beast fits the 8th house, a water house, the deep water. And so in the deep water, as we dive deep into our shadow and into the unconscious, what do we find? We find Hydra. And I'm not going to explore this right now, and because it's the subject for a whole other talk. It's just, there's so much in it. But still we can find a lot of richness just in thinking about it for a moment. And if we understand how important it is that we value, that we embrace the 8th house experience, that we embrace these crises when they come to us, because these crises are opportunities for us to be our own heroes. We are going down into the underground to retrieve this gold, to retrieve this illumined understanding, this deeper faith, and to resolve this sort of instinctive response to crisis, that can have us just repeating the cycles over and over again in a fairly addictive kind of manner. We can stop that by doing the work, the labor of Hercules in the 8th house. But there is a way, the 8th house is going to take us through it anyway. Because of the cycle, the 8th house, we are going to keep coming back to the 8th house throughout our lifetime, over and over again in many ways, and in a variety of signs, because Pluto goes through the signs, hits our charts in different ways, and other planets interact with Jupiter. So we have all, and Pluto, and so we have all these opportunities to really do the work of the 8th house. But I just really want to encourage you to see how important it is, and to appreciate it, to embrace it. And now, Linda, if you'll move on to the next slide. Now here I'm going to show you something of my theology, what has informed my theology. I heard something last spring. I was listening to a podcast in which Yuval Harari was being interviewed. He's written the book you may be familiar with, Sapiens, which is a very popular book recently on the history of the world. And also his latest book was on homosteis, man-God, right? Or man as God. And he's talking about religion, and he sees religion, one of the ways that religion has served us is to help ensure the survival of the species. And he said this is because, you know, its intent was to help us to live together and not kill each other off. Well, we also know that history shows that religion has really served as a very good reason to kill people, so including genocide. So we know that just like anything in life, anything can be used for bad or good. And what Yuval said in this interview, which I loved, is he said, the God of the theologians is not the God of the masses. And I think this is just so true, because I experience, of course, theology, which is simply God talk, as very exciting and interesting, because we're looking at how people make meaning. But most of us understand religion and theology perhaps as not helpful, because we think more of how people fight over their beliefs. And this is partly because we tend to hold beliefs tightly. Once we have them, we hold them tightly. We don't want to let go of them, because once they get through the 10th house, they harden, right? And they take on a form, and it's more difficult for us to let go of them. And so I like to encourage people not only to have their beliefs be fit for purpose in the first place. We want a very good design, an excellent ideal in the 9th house, so that when we take it into form, it will be a gift that is fit for purpose, that when we take it to the collective, will be received as it's intended, and then it will serve the one, the whole in the 12th house. So what I want to show you here is some of the theologians who are contemporary, have been more contemporary theologians, and have been leading us into, I believe, a new understanding. And this is energizing. It's very hard to see, because usually in the news are all the bad stories. And when we have encountered a lot of the religion of the masses, it makes us shudder, right? And this is especially true if you've been a truth seeker and you've really been doing your work. You're not necessarily going to be comfortable with where you find the masses are at the time. But my theology has been informed most greatly by process theology and creation-centered theology. So the process theology is based on the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. Henry Nelson Wyman is the one that I know the best. And Alfred North Whitehead, with his philosophy, by the way, Alfred North Whitehead is also, you know, foundational to Rick Tarnas's work and to his wife Becca Tarnas's work. It's just a point of interest. This theology locates God in the fourfold creative event. And so this might seem very strange at first, but you know, because a lot of the religions that exist today still locate God above. So it's the power over model. And so process theology locates God in the fourfold creative event, right within creation, in the process. And so that's why I'm suggesting we trust the process, trust the wheel of creation. Astrology fits perfectly with this. So the first step is in the process is increased awareness. The second, the integration of new meanings. The third, expanded appreciation. We can feel this, right? When we really learn something new that resonates, we just appreciate it so much. And this deepens and increases our experience of community. Matthew Fox, Henry Nelson Wyman, by the way, his tradition that he was embedded in, he's since died, his tradition that he was embedded in was the Unitarian Universalist Church, which some of you may have heard of. It's kind of a part of New Thought, which to some degree relies on the branch of Christianity, which was set aside by the Christian church as it really went through the 10th house, which we know as Gnosticism. And Gnosticism was very important during the New Age period that we just went through in the last 20, 30 years. So creation-centered theology, as espoused by Matthew Fox, looks at the fourfold path. And the fourfold path begins with via positiva, befriending creation, embracing all of creation, welcoming and allowing all of creation. It travels next to the via negativa. And this has to do with befriending the darkness, which really suits the 8th house, yes. Letting go and letting be. And that letting go part is so important when we go through the 8th house, because it has to do with letting go of our need to cling to the survival. It moves then to via creativa, befriending our role as co-creators of all that is, befriending our divinity. So once again, we're coming to that place where we would shine, our divinity shines forth, like the 5th house again, and we become ready to bring our gift of our divinity to the 11th house. Lastly, it embraces the via transformativa, befriends the new creation. And so that takes us all the way through the cycle. And I see these fourfold paths as working quite well with the 4 quadrants of the astrological chart. And we can see how they work in each individual. I've been doing some work trying to apply them, but I haven't gotten very far yet. So both of these theologies emphasize the goodness of creation. They emphasize creativity, compassion, reality of suffering and evil, mutuality and community, personal transformation, and social reconstruction. Can we please move to the next slide? And so what I want to encourage us to do is to be the water. We're experiencing the water when we enter into Scorpio. And nothing is weaker than water, but when it attacks something hard or resistant, then nothing withstands it, and nothing will alter its way. That's according to the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu. And the advice to Hercules when he was slaying Hydra, went to slay Hydra, his mentor said to him, "We rise by kneeling, we conquer by surrendering." So this experience of water hitting all of these constructed beliefs, all of this conditioning, all of these hidden things in our chart, and dissolving them, this is the process of deconstruction. It's what Ken Wilber, the philosopher, referred to as the flatland. Well, we don't live in the flatland. We can't live in the flatland. We cannot live without making meaning. So our values rise again. We begin to try to make meaning. And the lesson is to hold our beliefs closely, to value them, but to hold them lightly. Be prepared to lose our beliefs so that they can be replaced by beliefs that are fit for purpose. And we can just look at science for this. Newton's law of gravity got us to the moon, but Einstein's theory of relativity is more sufficient. Quantum mechanics is yet more fundamental. But each of them are important. So we don't just throw the first one away. It still works. It works, right? But it works at a different level. And we can see this too when we look in biology. We look at the cell. We can be looking at the cell. The cell is one thing. We look inside the cell, we find the atom. We look and we see the protons and neutrons, and now even the quarks. So knowledge is always evolving. Beliefs are evolving. Gods are evolving. We need to become like the water, surrender to the process. And the 8th house and Scorpio, the water will take us to land. So we need to just float. We need to float and we need to breathe, because if you're underwater, you need oxygen. And one of the things that crisis does is it causes us to hold our breath or to breathe shallowly. So I mean this in a physical sense. When you're facing this, breathe and just lean back and float. Just be the water. Don't offer resistance to the water. Be the water. Open your arms, embrace the water, and float. And so it is. I'm done.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sheila. That was incredible. So interesting. Thank you. So does anybody have a question or comment?
That was very good. Thank you so much.
Go ahead, Dom.
It was amazing. I only caught the end, but I really loved what you had to say about, each of the houses being an opportunity to work on everything before we get to that 8th, where it really hits the fan. Because it's so true. You can feel yourself moving through them. I think the Huber School of Astrology puts age points throughout the houses as well. That kind of ties in with what you were saying. I really love it. Thank you.
But we have to go back and visit whatever we didn't integrate, right? And we're going to do that every time we have a Scorpio influence, every single time. And I saw this over and over again, whatever we hadn't finished, we're going to go back because this is the impetus, we want our whole lives to matter. We do matter. We are all part of, every creation matters. Every incarnation matters. Everyone contributes to the whole. I see us as all part of God. And so we are contributing to the evolution of God, and each incarnation is significant. Each and every one. We are like, the God light shines through the prism, and we are like one fraction of the prism, or one part of the light, and yet we're all part of the light. And our incarnation really matters. No matter what evolutionary stage we're at, it's still contributing. And so whether we do participate consciously or unconsciously, we will participate. We will contribute, and we will provide for other people these instances of dialogue where, they will engage us. They will have this mirroring effect going on. What does Donald Trump mirror for me? We can say that to ourselves. Well, what am I seeing there? Do I see some of my own tendency to narcissism? Do I see what I don't want in a leader? Does this make me look at what I do want in a leader? How is it functioning for different people? It's functioning for different people in different ways, but it's carrying us all forward into the age of Aquarius. And he's pretty Aquarian in a lot of ways, Uranus is his descendant, So we could say that's his God that may not be sufficient, right? And it factors into that with his Pluto, which is in Leo in the 12th house, and his ascendant, which is in Leo. And so we see that that Donald Trump then would, and he has Uranus conjunct his sun in the 10th house. So we can see that Donald Trump then, in particular, would be wanting to be that. A friend of mine describes Aquarius as the shit disturber. So he would be constantly reverting to this, right? Going back to it every time he's trying to make meaning, every time there's a challenge to his sense of self. He's going to be trying to bolster the self by behaving more like a shit disturber. So he's constantly going to go to, how can I interrupt, disrupt, corrupt, erupt, but I'm going to cause chaos because that's my job. And he just sees it that way, and he will revert to that again and again and again until the 8th house forces him, Zeus, Jupiter, has those servants of violence and force, or the servants of Jupiter. And so those will force him through the 8th house before he can get to the 9th house of wisdom and illumined awareness. And so we have to let him do that, and he will do it for us too.
Okay, thank you so much. That brings us to the end of your meeting. Thank you from all of us. Would you all please thank Sheila Eisele?
Yay, Sheila, beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was very nice.
Thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you, Linda.